This unit is very tellingly not called imperialism, which is typically what I would call it in my honors class. Instead, this unit is called Consequences of Industrialization, which I think captures what it is that really propels Western Europe and, of course, North America, particularly the United States, into such a tremendous position of dominance after pretty devastatingly losing their American colonies at the beginning of this time frame of 1750 to 1900. Like they say in Star Wars, the Empire, in fact, does strike back. And it strikes back for some of the same reasons, but also some new ones. Spoiler alert, new here definitely doesn't mean better in this situation. Okay, so in today's episode, we're going to talk about the rationales for imperialism. Basically, how can the people who wrote about and supported the idea of natural rights, popular sovereignty, and the social contract be the same people who strip others of their rights, sovereignty, and ignore the social contract completely? You guessed it. It definitely takes a lot of mental gymnastics and, well, racism to make this one work. So let's get started. As I said just a little bit ago, the empire the Europeans amassed in their 16th and 17th century time frame in the Americas started to fall apart after 1750. Here you can see in this map what's going on at 1750, where Spain, Britain, France, etc. have a lot of empires. Britain first loses their North American colonies, so bye. France sells hers, so bye. Well, here, actually. And then Spain loses theirs, so bye. These colonies were markedly different from the empires that will be established in the second half of the 19th century for several reasons. First off, the Amerindians in the Americas, of course, had been wiped out by disease, and their political structures were derailed by the epidemics that raged after the arrival of Europeans, meaning that militarily, socially, economically, and politically, the Europeans could essentially remake the Americas in their image without a lot of resistance. And as we know, there was in fact resistance, notably the Pueblo Revolt, but long term, these were all rather unsuccessful. When we talk about the motivations for the Europeans who are doing the empire building in the Americas, we're going to talk about three main drivers: God, gold, and glory. So let's see how these fit into the justifications used in the post-Enlightenment world, supposedly by enlightened people, to divide the world up like this. We'll start with God. So missionaries played a huge role in Empire 2.0. With new inventions like the steamboat, American, British, and other missionaries like German missionaries could go to places in the global south like Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific to bring a Christianizing influence and spread the word of God and save souls. In this image, for example, we see that in the Pacific, we see idols, kind of these wrapped totems being burned. They're about to be burned in this image by missionaries in the Pacific. So these people often made first contact with the indigenous people who were living there, and they essentially became the lubricant to aid the arrival of later political and military types from the mother country. Often, this was definitely inadvertent. Most missionaries didn't go to places in the global south to butter up the natives for colonization. Instead, this was a byproduct of their longer exposure to the indigenous groups. They could later serve as interpreters, intermediaries, and points of contact for both parties. Missionaries also made the presence of foreign people, like Americans and Europeans, in the global south palatable to people at home who believed in natural rights and the social contract. If they were bringing Christianity and Christian values to people who were seen as heathens living a horrible, sinful life destined for hell, it made the whole mission excusable and even righteous. You can't very well leave people to live in sin and go to hell when you could save them, can you? Right? And here we see a political cartoon that basically captures that, right? We see an embodiment of the British Prime Minister up here at the top, this dude here, and of course Uncle Sam here, and they're carrying these, quote, heathen, barbaric people, right? And we can see also kind of how amazingly racist these are portrayed. And what they're doing, right, is they are going and they are conquering all these bad things that these people supposedly have, notably not white people, and they are going up towards the mountain at the pinnacle where is civilization. After God, of course, we have gold. So, unlike in the Americas, Europeans had been in contact with peoples in Africa, India, and Southeast Asia for generations upon generations. So, they knew what goods were available and from where. So, why didn't just a different, newer trading relationship start to happen and didn't really work for these Europeans? Why did they have to colonize these places? Why couldn't they just trade with them? Well, industrialization plays an important role here, and it's something that differentiates this type of imperialism from previous types of imperialism. So industrialization requires a constant stream of natural resources. We discussed how important these are to having an industrial revolution in the last unit. So what's going on here? Why aren't the Europeans just using their own? Well, because they just need more. In order for capitalism to work, it needs to be able to grow. Now that we have the steamboat and railroads, industrial material and products can be transported from far away to the industrial centers in Europe and North America. Now, an industrialist can go into the Congo, mine their resources, ship them to their country, and it's all easier and cheaper. Right here, we can kind of see in this political cartoon the idea of Africa as a cake, right? And that kind of provides this idea of it's just a bounty for people to divide up and share the spoils of. But wait. Hold on. Why do they need to go into the Congo? Why aren't the Congolese doing this and then selling it to the Europeans? Oh, right. Because their economy became based on slavery, and a variety of wars and instability thereafter meant that the political situation was not really in a place to harness their own resources. Oops. Anyway, the need for raw materials to process in these factories drives the accumulation of overseas colonies. It also gives them a growing market for their factory-produced goods. The more people I control politically, the more people I can give my companies the opportunity to sell their products to. More colonies equal more raw materials and more customers. Maybe also more problems. One of these problems, however, was not technology. Europeans finally had the technology to be able to travel overseas quickly, cheaply, and efficiently, using steamboats and communicating back home using telegraph wires. Furthermore, a new medicine called quinine was developed, which prevented Europeans from getting malaria, which is a nasty disease that had pretty much stopped Europeans from going much farther inland than port cities in Africa. Steamboats also allowed them to get upriver and deep into the African continent when they couldn't before because their horses would catch a disease and they all died, which is why there aren't any horses native to sub-Saharan Africa, just zebras, and they're really mean. Oh, and there was the nasty little business of the Maxim machine gun. Hiram Maxim invents what essentially becomes a machine gun. Native resistance really didn't stand a chance when the British or other soldiers could just mow them down. Check out this quote from Hilaire Belloc's 1898 book, quote, A Traveler's Account. He says, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." So there's that. Our third G, glory. There are a few things going on in this section. First, I want to talk about competition between European states. I really feel like we talk about this a lot. But anyway, especially following the Napoleonic Wars, European nation states are a thing. We've talked about the rise of nation states and nationalism and how this challenges imperial products, but also how it supports the idea of imperialism. Anyway, after the Napoleonic Wars, some nation states in Europe are, quote, great powers, and some aren't. Anyone who wants to be a great power has to rise in status, and one of the ways that they could rise in status is to gain a colonial empire. This proves to other nation states that you are cool, and you are powerful, and you are great. So we see going on in this super popular political cartoon the idea of these great powers dividing up China, and we can see them represented by kind of stereotypical people. So here's Queen Victoria, here's the Kaiser in Germany, here's the Tsar in Russia, here's the Shogun in Japan, and here's Marianne from France. Meanwhile, this super stereotypical Manchu guy is kind of arguing over them, dividing him up like a pizza pie. And then in this one may be a little bit more controversial for us because we typically don't see American history this way. But here is Colombia, right, Our Lady Liberty, and she is becoming a world power by using her army and her navy. Particularly, she will be doing this This is from 1901. And she will be doing this with we'll call it annexation, that's a nice word, of Spain's colonial territories of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Okay, so glory part 2, social Darwinism. First, let me say, social Darwinism is very not cool. But the Europeans and the Americans at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century really thought that it was. In the beginning of the 19th century, a rich and aimless kid named Charles Darwin sets off on a tour of the Galapagos Islands as the, quote, gentleman companion of the captain of a ship called the Beagle. Basically, he was there to be a socially equal friend to the captain, who was otherwise surrounded by low-class sailor types. While he's on this trip, Darwin has some epiphanies about selective breeding and natural selection that he later formulates into his theory of evolution through natural selection. You may have heard of it. Well, in the latter half of the 19th century, this theory gets applied to races. Yes, 2 types of people. And you'll never guess which group of people is the, quote, most evolved, unless you guessed Europeans. If, in that case, then you're right. And here's a nice diagram that shows how they felt about it. So the thinking of social Darwinism was further supported by more what we call pseudoscience, right? Like fake science, such as phrenology, which is the measuring of different parts of your face, and craniology, which is the measuring of your cranium. And certain parts of your cranium were associated with certain psychological traits, intellectual traits. I don't know. Basically, it's all fake, so it doesn't matter. And what this was trying to prove was that there are physiological differences between the races that showed the advanced evolution of white people. These have all been disproven, and you really can't tell the race of a person based on their skeleton because we're all actually the same species, which is Homo sapiens sapiens, and that's just really all there is to it. So this scientific racism and basically the egotism of Europeans, for the most part, created a situation that was very much like, well, we get to take this land because we're better and smarter, and we can prove it through fake science, and also, our Industrial Revolution, which you didn't do. They saw the other races as unfit barbarians who didn't deserve their land, right? They literally used the term unfit. So if they weren't going to use it the way Europeans were, then they just didn't deserve it. A few people are pretty intrinsically linked with these developments, notably not Darwin himself, who spent most of the rest of his world or life in an actually kind of unscientific world. So I'm going to introduce you to 2 Brits, Cecil Rhodes and Rudyard Kipling. Cecil, I'll write it for you. Here's Cecil Rhodes. Cecil is kind of the industrial face of the British Empire. An Oxford grad, the Rhodes Scholarship is actually named after him, who grew up in South Africa. He worked hard to grow the glory of the British Empire and himself. He gets involved in the diamond industry in South Africa, most notably the De Beers family, at the ground level, and uses his political positions and power. He became a member of the South African Parliament to exact treaties from native tribes and kingdoms for access to their land and to pass laws that restricted their movement, access to political power and resources, and pushed them off the more valuable land itself. He was an ardent imperialist who sought to push the British Empire from Cape Town to Cairo, so that he could be the one to build that railroad and move his diamonds. In this image is kind of a famous political cartoon of him. He's called the Rhodes Colossus, which is a play off of the ancient Greek island of Rhodes, where this famous statue, one of the wonders of the ancient world, stood standing across the harbor. So rather than standing across the harbor, here is Cecil Rhodes standing across the continent of Africa from, Cape to Cairo. And these are telegraph wires that would go along that kind of railroad line. So more about Cecil. One of my favorite, as in actually least favorite, I'm being very sarcastic, quotes from him goes as such, quote, "I contend that we," naturally the British, "are the first race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race." Nice, Cecil. Real nice. So the second imperialist that I want to introduce you to is actually someone you may have met before. His name is Rudyard Kipling. And he is the author of The Jungle Book, Rikki Tikki Tavi, and a nice, not racist at all poem called The White Man's Burden. Rudyard, he and I are on a first name basis after all these years, was born in India to a rather prominent family. For example, his cousin was prime minister back in England a few times. And he was deeply inspired by the land and people there. He was also, of course, a product of his times and the imperial milieu that overflows from everything British in the Victorian era. We're going to look at the poem in a second. But first, I want to talk about how the poem, while written by a British imperialist, is actually a celebration of the United States joining the ranks of being an imperial power by gaining Spain's old colonies from the Spanish-American War of 1898. And what we gain is Guam, Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, which we can see represented here in this political cartoon called School Begins, where Uncle Sam is giving quite a racist lesson to these very racistly represented new colonial possessions that the United States has, right? So the Philippines is over here, Hawaii is over here, Puerto Rico, Cuba, right? And then back here are Texas and Alaska, so other places that we had been acquiring. You can see that this stereotypically represented Chinese person is outside because we had actually passed something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevented Chinese immigration, which isn't racist at all. And here is a Native individual who has he's been shunted off to the corner, and he has his ABC book, but it's upside down, kind of indicating in a pretty horrible, cringy way what this cartoonist thinks the United States feels about its native population. And of course, not even being permitted to learn is a very racistly represented African-American person who's not allowed to learn at all, but rather is forced to clean. So that kind of shows this political image of how the United States treats non-white peoples.
Okay, so here we go. Here's the poem.
Take up the white man's burden,
send forth the best you breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness, unfluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. We're going to break it down kind of a stanza at a time. So when he says, send forth the best you breed, the idea is that this is a burden, right? That going out and being a colonizer is weighty, and it is hard, and it is challenging. And so we really should be sending forth our best sons, our best stock. So it were, right? Go bind your sons to exile. This is not easy.
And why are they going?
They're going to serve our captives' need. They're going for the colonized people to help them, to wait in heavy harness, right? Like that they are almost like hooked up to a cart, right? That they are a beast of burden, right? And there's a lot of that imagery going on here. So the white man's burden, breeding, being bound, serving, harness, right? Like so all of this imagery of a beast of burden. Unfluttered folk and wild, right? These people are not very civilized. They're not serious. They're childlike. They have childlike whims, and they change their mind all the time, that kind of stuff. Your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. It just makes me feel like Tinkerbell, like Tinkerbell when she gets all pouty. And that's kind of sullen. And then Tinkerbell also, she's not really a person. She's a pixie, an elf. I don't know what Tinkerbell is. Whatever. But this image of one, we've caught people. That's weird. And two, they're half devil and half child. So like, oh, wow. Okay.
Take up the white man's burden, and patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror, and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. So again, right? Why are we going? We're going to help them to seek their profit, to work their gain. Right? It is a burden. But we have to be super patient. We have to veil all the threats of violence. That's weird. We have to show pride. We can't be arrogant. We can't be bossy. We need to speak openly and simply to these people because they're wink, nudge, nudge, not very bright. So you should be super plain in how you speak about it. Right,
and I'll go through the rest of this poem and look at it in comparison to its responses in another episode.
Of course, the noted problematic nature of this poem did not go unchallenged. In fact, like I said, there were anti-imperial and pacifist societies that openly published critiques of the poem and the ideology behind it that I'll discuss in a supplementary episode. But something I want to leave you with is this. From an 1899 grammar book for children called ABCs for Baby Patriots, we can see how deeply linked nationalism and empire are in this period. I think it's fair to say that empire defined, in part, what it actually meant to be British, for example. C is one of the most outstanding to me. C is for colonies, rightly we boast, but of all the great nations, Great Britain has the most. Or E. E is our empire, where sun never sets. The larger we make it, the bigger it gets. Or I. I is for India, our land in the east, where everyone goes to shoot tigers and feast. Well, that's nice. What a great place this India must be. It's like a big backyard party, not like, a place that was an empire for a while on its own. F is the flag, which wherever you see, you know that beneath it, you're happy and free. Well, not everyone was happy and free beneath that flag. In fact, for many, it was quite the opposite. Thanks for watching.